So I'm just getting the technology squared away and we'll get going. So I'm, as you know, filling in for our normal minister who just walked in, Owen, and I'm not the regular guy. So I said I would fill in by diving in and picking a sermon out of my bucket of prepared stuff. And I ended up not doing that. My mom requested that I prepare a sermon on calling on the name of the Lord. And in doing so, I realized, I was reminded that it takes a long time to rightly divide the word of truth, to prepare a sermon. Joe wants me to put this on. This technology, I'll tell you. So I appreciate, and I was reminded how long it takes to prepare one of these guys. So I appreciate what Owen goes through every time he gets up here. And so all of us should thank him for the job he does and puts in. I guess I can't go too far. I won't strap this on. So as I mentioned, my mom requested the sermon. So she's obviously not here. She's in Tennessee. So I'm recording this for her, and we'll try and figure out a way to put this on YouTube. And if I do, and it's worth listening to, I'll share that with the folks here as well. And you'll see the slides and the audio captured. You'll even see a little picture of me in the lower right-hand corner. But I once heard a preacher say, as a great line, who cares who I am? I'm just a nobody trying to tell everybody about somebody who can save anybody. And so that's what we'll do this morning, and we'll do it in the context of calling on the name of the Lord and what that means. There are really three kind of main topics here. I'll help if I turn this guy on. Maybe you have to do it the old-fashioned way then. Oh, it's working good. So the first portion of the sermon topic is, what is our relationship to God? If we're going to call on the name of the Lord, what does that mean in the context of our relationship to him? We'll talk about the power of the name of the Lord and how serious that is, and kind of close with a look at what is our responsibility in light of that when calling on the name of the Lord. So first, we'll talk about what is the relationship between God and man. And for this, and I should have mentioned, there are a couple of slides that if you're seated close enough, you may see some wavy lines on the high resolution. It only happens a couple of times, and I don't want to be responsible for any convulsions. So if it bothers you, just kind of look away for a quick second. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9 is where we'll start this discussion, where God instructs Isaiah to tell the people of Israel, my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. In fact, he says, for as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. There's an analogy here that the people of Israel will understand as they look up into the sky at both in day and at night. And he's obviously not saying what you can see is how much higher my thoughts are. It even goes beyond that to what you can't see. That's how much higher my thoughts are than yours. So what can we see today? Well, this is one of the most famous images taken from the Hubble telescope. That's that thing that orbits the Earth and looks out into space and takes high-res images and sends them back. Wikipedia says we've learned a lot of astrophysics from the thing, And this is what a news source says about this. And this is quoting now. The NASA Hubble Space Telescope has revisited one of its most iconic and popular images, the Eagle Nebula's Pillars of Creation. This image shows the pillars as seen in visible light, capturing the multicolored glow of gas clouds, wispy tendrils of dark cosmic dust, and the rust-colored elephant's trunks of the nebula's famous pillars. The dust and gas in the pillars is seared by the intense radiation from young stars eroded by the strong winds of massive nearby stars. With these new images comes better contrast and a clearer view for astronomers to study how the structure of the pillars is changing over time. So that's the quote. And this quote, as iconic and beautiful as this image is, the quote that came with us raised a lot of questions for me. So the first is, what does revisited mean? Does that mean we may need to revisit it even yet again? And the second is the very name of the image. It's called the Pillars of Creation, not the Pillars of Evolution. And where I come from, creation implies there has to have been a creator. So also, part of the quote was, it offers astrophysicists a clearer chance to study the image. And it kind of begs the question for me, study what image and what happens when we get a clear image of that in the next few years? And finally, the part about how it's changing over time. What does that mean? Didn't this happen billions of years ago and we're just seeing it now? And what does it mean? What do we compare the image that comes in to? Is there no end to this stuff? And it turns out we really don't know. There is really no end to it. So out of frustration, I Googled definition of the universe. And here's what I got from Wikipedia. And read it, you can read it with me. The universe is the totality of everything that exists, has existed, and ever will exist. The part of the universe that we can see, referred to as the observable universe, has a diameter of, it describes the diameter. I think Camille, and with her math and science, is probably the person who could, if you're interested, describe this better than I. And it says, some physicists have speculated there is more than one universe. So that, for me, begs a lot of questions. But the second part really caught my eye, the part of the universe that we can see. And that the reason it caught my eye, if you'll pardon the pun, is how do we even see this in the first place? Well, it turns out for that explanation of how we see stuff, to study it, you've got to go back to science, and they're trying to describe the way the human eye works. Turns out the human eye is probably the most complex organism in the whole body. And science has a pretty good explanation of how it works, but there's still a vast field of study of this organ. And processing these images is only the beginning, because after that, and this is a simplified diagram, there's the brain processing it all. And I'm not even going to try to go through this diagram, but it's a lot more of a mystery even than the eye. And science has a basic idea of what the parts of the brain are, but not a clue how it really works together. So putting this whole chain together, we've got some astrophysicists that have relied on this man-made telescope that's pointed outward to get these images that they bring back, that they're then looking at with their eye to study the image. And they're studying it with their brain. none of which we really understand how it works in the first place. So remember what God told Isaiah to remind the Israelites. My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are my ways your ways. So wait a second. So I thought this was God telling Isaiah to tell the Israelites to follow him and not their own desires. And that is true. And that is completely in context. So when God talks about his plan for salvation, for us being called his children, that is where the perspective of the relationship between God and man becomes most obvious. In fact, he'll do it again in 1 Corinthians when Paul writes, the foolishness of God is wiser than man, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Of course, God doesn't have foolishness or weakness. That is how some men perceive God. And Paul is saying, even if that were true, no matter how smart we ever become, God would still be greater. And it just makes sense. So no matter how smart we become, how much science we know, it's only a small scratch compared to God. Consider this. 500 years ago, in the 1500s, there were some big inventions. For example, the microscope was invented in the 1500s. They could see worlds then that they had only kind of speculated about before, or maybe didn't even know existed. The pencil was invented in the 1500s. And so instead of knowing how to use the quill and the ink and refilling the ink and getting more ink, all of a sudden anybody could write messages to each other, and it changed the way communication took place between people. Something we talked about this morning, the thermometer was invented at that time. So instead of kind of doing this number and guessing if your baby had a fever, you could now tell right away and track it with certainty. It was a huge medical advancement at that time. They also, in the 1500s, came out with a beautiful, very complex diagram explaining how the earth was at the center of the universe. So fast forward 500 years, and we have some advancements of our own. We talked about the Hubble telescope already and how we can see worlds that we didn't know existed before. And so there are 3D printers that have given us the ability to create things in hours that used to take months or weeks. And there are advancements in medical technology that have made MRIs so clear and good from our perspective that we're able to see things that we couldn't before. But here's the question. In 500 years from now, or maybe 100 years even from now, people are going to look back at us and see us as primitively as we saw the people 500 years ago. And they'll also think, oh, they thought X, and I'm not sure what X is, but X is like the earth being the center of the universe. Oh, these guys, there's something we're missing that we're just wrong about, that in 100 years or 500 years, people will say, oh, they just didn't know any better. So this all kind of gets back to the fact that in Psalm 19:1, the psalmist notes that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. And so everything that we uncover or discover or find leads us to the belief that, as Paul did, even uses this point as a reason to look around and see and understand the existence of God. So in Romans 8:20, Paul writes, the invisible things of him are seen from the creation of the world, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that people, are without excuse. So we could go a lot of places from this passage. A proper response of man involves a lot of things, and there are a lot of things to consider, but we have a very narrow agenda this morning in studying our appropriate response to this relationship when it comes to calling on the name of the Lord. So in my opinion, one of the most fundamental places for us to start thinking about is the power of the name of the Lord. That's the second point in our sermon this morning. So the first thing most of us want to find out when we meet someone is, what is their name? So think about how you feel when someone uses your name correctly. And if you've had the experience of having your name used incorrectly, what does that feel like? I caught to doing it this morning. I called Sophie Sophia. Now, I know a little girl named Sophia. That's no excuse. It's on me to get it right. So what does it feel like when your name is used incorrectly? And given what you know about our relationship to God that we just looked at, how do you think God feels about his name being used correctly or incorrectly? Wanting to call upon the Lord or invoke the name of God is a natural human inclination. So for millennia, people have been calling out to the name of the Lord. And how far back that we know about. So in Genesis 4, verse 26, Seth has a child that he names Enos. And remember, Seth is a child of Adam and Eve. So he's very early on in creation. So in 4:26, Seth has a son, and he calls his name Enos. And we read, then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. And it's been speculated because Enos means frail or mortal. And it's been speculated that people were starting to realize, hey, we're mortal. And that's why we need to call upon the name of the Lord. So what does this mean? Let's back up a second. Calling on the name of the Lord. What does that even mean? It turns out there is a passage in Jeremiah that holds a lot of insight as to how this happens. And we're about to study this, I think, on Wednesday night in 2 or 3 weeks here. And so Jeremiah 29:12 says, then shall ye call upon me, and ye shall go and pray unto me, and I will hearken unto you. And notice the word and. It's not worked yet. Notice the word and right here. So there are two things happening here. The word call upon me before and. The word call is the Hebrew word quara, Q-A-R-A, and it literally means to call, to cry, to utter out loud, to call upon someone or invoke someone. It's actually the same word that's used in Leviticus 13 when lepers are instructed to call out, unclean, unclean, to let people know they had been declared unclean and to steer clear. So in the Old Testament, people called out loud upon the name of the Lord as a normal act of worship. So many that we don't have time to look at all of them, but there are a few notable examples. So Abraham built an altar in Genesis 12:8 and called upon the name of the Lord. Isaac in Genesis 26 did the same thing. Samson did the same thing in Judges. David did the same. Samuel did the same thing. 1 Samuel 12. David did the same thing. In 2 Samuel 22:4. Elijah did the same thing. In 1 Kings 18:24. And Jeremiah said, I called upon your name, O Jehovah. Lamentations 3 and verse 55. So a couple of the Old Testament prophets said, hey, not only have people call on the name of the Lord, they are going to be calling on the name of the Lord in the future. And that's exactly what the most notable example is Joel. In Joel chapter 2, verse 32, he states, everyone who calls on the name of Jehovah will be saved. And that is exactly what happened ultimately in the New Testament. So on the day of Pentecost, in Acts 2, there is the story of the disciples being gathered together to worship. And Peter is there, and there's a big sound like a rushing wind. And if you'll remember, cloven tongues that look kind of like fire are settling on the disciples, and they start speaking in different languages. And all the Jews who've been gathered together from different lands are present in Jerusalem at the time. They all speak different languages, and they hear the disciples speaking in their own language. So some disciples are speaking, presumably, some disciples are speaking one language, some are speaking another language, but they're all speaking the same thing, the same message about Jesus. And the Jews who are hearing them say to Peter, some say, what does this mean? And others say, oh, these guys are just drunk. And Peter says, well, these men are not drunk as ye suppose, seeing it's really early in the morning. But this is what's happening that the prophet Joel told you was going to happen. And he talks about the fact that your young men will prophesy, and then those who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. So that's a crash course. Of course, we read later in the chapter that Peter points out that if you call upon the name of the Lord and repent, you can then be baptized. And we'll come back to the plan of salvation a little later. But it comes down to understanding that. And as that plan is often presented, it requires that we be faithful unto death. And so the very earliest Christians knew this. And we even looked at this in class this morning. Maybe even some of these converts knew that, but they knew calling upon the Lord. And again, it says calling upon the Lord was a way to identify themselves as Christians, even if it meant their death. So the person who would become the Apostle Paul is Saul now. And as we talked about in Bible class, he was not always playing for the Christian team. In fact, he was putting Christians to death and in prison, so much so that Ananias said in Acts 9, verse 16, he's putting in prison anyone who would call upon the name of the Lord. Now, I should mention that anytime in the New Testament, which is in Hebrew, which is in Greek, the word call is the same meaning as the Hebrew meaning, which means calling upon the name of the Lord is different than prayer. It's different than confessing the name of the Lord. And it's very clear that when the Christians were persecuted, even to the point of death, they were doing so in Acts 9 because they were calling upon the name of the Lord. So we've got some examples here to go on and some of the reasons that people called upon the name of the Lord. So let's take a quick look now at what it means for us today. So given that God is God, and we have some examples to go on, what is our responsibility toward the name of the Lord today? And before we look at what our obligations are to call on the name of the Lord, let's make sure we know how not to misuse the name of the Lord. So I think a lot of us know the Ten Commandments from childhood, and we know that all but one was reiterated in some way in the New Testament. Our understanding of this third commandment needs to be expanded today from just the use of God and Jehovah. And here's what I mean by that. So in Philippians 2, 9 through 11, is clear. It's not just the name of God we need to watch out for. It's Jesus and Christ and anything that has a common tendency to sneak into our vernacular today. And I doubt if anyone used those names back in vain back in the Old Testament. But remember, those names are sacred as well, too. They are not to be tossed around or used as an explanation. Philippians 2 says, therefore God exalted him, Jesus, to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, and in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus is Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So this one is meant to be funny, and you may have seen it, but it makes a point. So just like none of us likes it when our name is misused, think about misusing a name that is so much higher than ours. Of course, I wouldn't recommend this either, and a tip of the hat to a guy named Brent Willey here, who was one of the speakers at the Dublin lectureship, and it was on James, and he had Taming the Tongue, and one of the points he made is that we need to be very respectful in our communications with each other, because we are all made, in ourselves, because we are all made in God's image. And unfortunately, that communication with each other can have some very negative consequences that may seem innocuous to us, like the following. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine because it's become so common. And this is one of the common examples that you'll often hear or see in text messages. And I'll give you my opinion on why it's bad. I think I can and I am piecing together a very solid scriptural case for why this should not be done. But this is not a case of mispronouncing or intentionally swearing. In fact, it's so similar to an invocation to the God that we hold dear that I fear it's a spiritual equivalent of ringing God's doorbell and then walking away. It's like starting a prayer, dear God, and then just not completing it. So I think I made my point. I'm going to run out of time, and I could get really worked up about this, but let's talk about something a little more pleasant here. And that something more pleasant is the context of calling on the Lord in the plan of salvation. In just a moment, we'll all stand, and Joe will lead us in a song that's not typically used after a lesson, but it's very appropriate for this one. And the song kind of mirrors the structure of this sermon. So the first couple of verses are about God's power and how it's evident in so much that we do. And the last two verses talk about the sacrifice that God made for us in sending his son, and confessing the name of the Lord plays a key response in our part to that relationship, which will lead us to be in heaven with him one day. Of course, if you're going to confess your belief in something, you need to hear about it and believe what it is, and then live differently, or what the Bible calls repentance. So the next couple of steps involve confession, and they're inextricably linked. So, and I want to be really clear about this. Public confession of faith, the public confession or calling on the name of the Lord, is its own step. As Romans 10 says, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. As Scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. For there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all, and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So that is how important confession of the name of Christ is. So the fifth step of baptism is something that is so important that we often inextricably link those two steps of confession and baptism. In fact, the calling on the name of the Lord often happens in baptistries. So, incidentally, and this isn't a study on the necessity of baptism, but it's worth mentioning one example quickly. In Acts 8, when Philip preaches to a eunuch that he's met, we read about the eunuch realizing what he needs to do to be saved, and he says, hey, here's water. What hinders me from being baptized? And we read about Philip taking him into the water and baptizing him. But we don't read about him calling on the name of the Lord like Romans 10 says is required. Does that mean he didn't do it? Well, of course, he did it as part of the confession and the baptism. Those two things are that linked together, but I'm digressing a bit. So there is one last step, and I'm so glad that this has been added. It didn't used to, when I was little, it wasn't added, but it's an important step. So after baptism, living and being faithful unto death is important for all of us. And calling on the name of the Lord is something that we all continue to do out of a pure heart. As 2 Timothy 2 says, if a man therefore purges himself from these things, he shall be a vessel unto honor, sanctified and meet for the master's use, and prepare for every good work. Flee youthful lusts, but follow righteousness, faith, charity, and peace with them that call on the Lord out of a pure heart. Hey, if all that sounds good to you and you want to know more about this process and how to go through it, or if we can pray for you or help you live in such a way that you're consistently calling on the name of the Lord among us, just come on up and let us know what your needs are as we stand in and sing.